The morning Edith Reed found wildflowers on her doorstep, she had already decided that hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Harlan's Crossing, Wyoming Territory, sat baking under a sky so blue it looked painted by someone who had never known a hard day in their life. Edith stood in the doorway of the modest two-room house she rented from old Magnus Pritchett, staring down at the small bundle of purple clover, yellow buttercups, and orange Indian paintbrush that had been laid with surprising care across her threshold. No note, no explanation. Just wildflowers, still damp with early morning dew, arranged so deliberately that they could not have simply blown there on the wind. She picked them up slowly, turned them over in her hands, and felt something stir in her chest that she quickly smothered. She was 31 years old, and she had stopped allowing herself the indulgence of feeling things she could not explain. Edith had come to Harlan's Crossing 8 months ago with a trunk full of practical clothing, a small leather case of medical instruments, and a letter from the Wyoming Territorial Board of Medicine confirming her appointment as the town's new physician's assistant. She was not a doctor. The law in 1878 would have found several creative ways to prevent that, but she had trained for 4 years under Dr. Clarence Hadley in Ohio, and she knew enough to keep people alive when the nearest full physician was 40 miles away in Cheyenne. The people of Harlan's Crossing had needed someone, and Edith had needed somewhere to be. It had seemed, if not a perfect arrangement, at least a practical one. The thing she had not told anyone in Harlan's Crossing was that she had left Ohio following the collapse of everything she had built there. A man named George Whitfield, to whom she had been engaged for 3 years, had married the daughter of a banker 6 weeks before their planned wedding. He had told her, in the sort of calm, measured voice that men reserved for moments when they were about to do something truly terrible, that he had been thinking about their future, and he believed they wanted different things. What he had meant, she understood later, was that he had found someone whose dowry included a house on the good side of Dayton. Edith had taken her instruments and her dignity and walked out of his parlor without crying, which she considered one of the great achievements of her life. She had not cried once in the 8 months since. She had simply stopped believing that new beginnings were real things and not just stories people told themselves to keep moving. She set the wildflowers in a tin cup of water on her windowsill, and when to open the small clinic, she ran out of the front room of her house. By mid-morning she had cleaned and stitched a gash on the arm of Pete Lowry, the blacksmith's apprentice, who had managed to be careless with a piece of hot iron in a way that suggested he was still not entirely awake when he arrived at work. She had given Mrs. Clara Dean a tonic for her persistent cough and a firm instruction to keep out of the cold night air, which Clara would ignore. She had checked on old Mr. Abe Kettler, who was recovering from a broken leg, and complained with such theatrical dedication that Edith had begun to suspect he was enjoying himself. It was while she was washing her hands after Abe's visit that she heard the sound of hooves outside, followed by the particular kind of silence that settled over a street when something unusual had arrived. She dried her hands on her apron and stepped outside. A man she had never seen before was tying a bay horse to the post in front of the general store across the street. He was tall, somewhere around 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the kind of lean, efficient build that came from years of physical work rather than any particular vanity about it. He wore a dark brown hat with a slight cavalry tilt to the brim, a plain canvas duster, and worn leather boots with the dust of serious travel on them. He moved with an unhurried certainty, checking his horse's water and patting the animal's neck before he even looked up at the town around him, which told Edith more about his character than most men manage to communicate in an hour of conversation. He was not extraordinarily handsome in the magazine illustration sense of the word. His face was too lived-in for that, sun-weathered with fine lines at the corners of his eyes, a jaw that was square and set with a slight scar running through the left side of it. but there was something in the way he held himself, a quiet, watchful stillness, that made it hard to look away from him. He was, Edith guessed, around 33 or 34 years of age. He turned and saw her looking at him from across the street. He touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers, a gesture so natural and unaffected that she found herself nodding back before she had made any conscious decision to do so. Then she went back inside, because she was a grown woman with work to do and not someone who stood in the street staring at strangers. She found out his name within the hour, because Harlan's Crossing was a town of approximately 240 people, and information traveled through it the way water traveled through dry ground, fast and unstoppable. His name was Raymond Keene. He had ridden in from the Powder River country up north, where he had spent the past 5 years working cattle drives and range work for a string of different outfits. He was, according to Hattie Carmichael, who ran the laundry, and knew everything about everyone within 48 hours of their arrival, 34 years old, unmarried, and had come to Harlan's Crossing because Magnus Pritchett had offered him a job managing the eastern portion of his ranch. Magnus owned a substantial piece of land 2 miles outside of town, and he was getting old enough that he needed someone capable to handle the day-to-day running of the cattle operation. Raymond Keene was, by Hattie's breathless accounting, exactly that kind of capable. Edith absorbed this information the way she absorbed most information, practically, without sentimentality, and returned to her work. She found out something else the following morning, when she opened her front door to find a second cluster of wildflowers on her doorstep. This time it was bluebell and yarrow, and something with tiny white petals she did not immediately identify. They had been laid even more carefully than the first bunch, bound together with a strip of dried grass wound 3 times around their stems. She stood looking at them for a long moment. Then she picked them up, put them in the tin cup beside the previous flowers, and made a decision. She asked Magnus Pritchett about it that afternoon when he came in for his weekly review of his various aches. Magnus was 72, shaped like a barrel that had been left in the sun too long, and possessed of an honesty so blunt it occasionally qualified as rude. He was also one of the few people in Harlan's Crossing whom Edith genuinely liked. "Magnus," she said, pressing gently on his shoulder to check the old injury that troubled him, "someone has been leaving wildflowers on my doorstep. 2 mornings now." Magnus made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cough. "That would be Raymond," he said. Edith kept her expression professional. "Your new ranch manager. Just started 3 days ago." Magnus shifted in his chair. "He asked me day he arrived who the woman was across the street from the general store. I told him you were the physician's assistant and that you'd come out from Ohio and that you were about as approachable as a porcupine when people annoyed you. He listened to all of it, and then he nodded and went to go look after his horse." Magnus paused. "He picked those flowers himself, I expect. Boys always noticing the landscape. Drives through perfectly good cattle country, and the thing he remarks on is what's growing along the creek." Edith said nothing for a moment. She finished her examination of his shoulder and made a note in her record book. "He should introduce himself properly," she said, "rather than leaving anonymous bundles of plant life." "That's Raymond for you," Magnus said comfortably. "Does things his own way, doesn't rush." He squinted at her. "Does it bother you, the flowers?" Edith considered the question with more honesty than she had intended. "No," she said. "That is the odd part." She met Raymond Keene the next morning, and she met him because she was not the sort of woman who waited for things to happen to her. She had risen early, before the town was properly awake, and walked to the creek at the edge of Harlan's Crossing, where the bank was soft, and wildflowers grew in scattered patches among the buffalo grass. She had brought her medical bag because she had told herself she was going to gather some yarrow, which had genuine medicinal applications as a wound-stanching herb, and this was partially true. She had also brought herself, which was entirely the point. He was there, crouching at the edge of the creek bank in the gray pre-dawn light, his hat pushed back on his head, turning something over in his hands. He looked up when he heard her boots on the soft ground, and he was not startled, which told her he had already heard her coming and had simply waited to see what she would do. "Mr. Keene," she said, because she was not going to pretend she didn't know who he was. He stood, and he was taller than he had seemed across a street. "Miss Reed," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the way his movements were. There was a slight accent in it that she couldn't fully place somewhere in the southwest of things, softened by years of moving around. "You've been leaving flowers on my doorstep," she said. "Yes," he said. He did not apologize for it or explain it with excessive words. He simply confirmed it and looked at her steadily, as though he was prepared to accept whatever judgment she passed. Edith found this approach both infuriating and deeply appealing, which was an uncomfortable combination. "It's an unusual introduction," she said. "I didn't figure I had enough to say yet to introduce myself properly," he said. "Didn't want to come up to you empty-handed. So you came up to me with wildflowers instead. I noticed them growing out here. It seemed like the kind of thing that didn't cost much to give and might mean something to receive." He paused. "Did it?" She looked at him for a moment. In the growing morning light, she could see his eyes clearly for the first time, dark brown, very direct, with that particular quality of attention that made a person feel they were being genuinely seen rather than merely observed. "It confused me," she said honestly. "I haven't been confused in quite some time." Something shifted in his expression that she thought might be the beginning of a smile, though it didn't fully arrive. "That's something, at least," he said. "Raymond Keene," she said. "How long have you been riding through other people's country?" "Long enough," he said. 5, 6 years. Before that I was in Texas. Before that I was in Kansas. I've moved around." "What made you stop moving?" He looked at her steadily. "I haven't stopped yet, but Magnus offered me something worth staying for, at least for a while." She picked a piece of yarrow from the bank beside her, examining it in the growing light. "I came out here to gather herbs," she said. "I figured it wasn't to find me," he said. "Though I don't mind either way." She surprised herself by almost smiling. "Almost. You can help me gather yarrow," she said, "since you apparently know what grows where out here." He crouched down without another word and began carefully selecting stems, and they worked side by side in the early morning quiet for 20 minutes without saying much at all, which was the most comfortable Edith had felt in the company of another human being in longer than she wanted to admit. The days that followed were a careful, deliberate unfolding of something neither of them rushed. Raymond came into her clinic for the first time 4 days after the Creek morning, not because he was injured or ill, but because Pete Lowry, the blacksmith's apprentice, had burned his other arm, and Raymond had ridden past the smithy, noticed the situation, and brought the boy in on horseback before Edith had even been informed of the accident. He stood in her doorway holding his hat in both hands while she cleaned and dressed Pete's burn, and he answered her questions about the accident with the efficient accuracy of a man who had a habit of observing situations clearly. After Pete had been dispatched home with instructions and a salve, Raymond remained in the doorway. He turned his hat slowly in his hands. "You've got a good way with frightened people," he said. "Pete was in a state when I found him. You had him calm inside of 2 minutes." "Medicine works better when the patient isn't panicking," Edith said, washing her hands. "True enough." He paused. "I was wondering if you might take supper with me Friday evening, at Carmichael's dining room." Edith dried her hands. She looked at the wildflowers still standing in their tin cups on her windowsill. She had pressed a few of the dried ones inside her medical record book without fully acknowledging to herself that she was doing so. She looked at Raymond Keene standing in her doorway with his hat in his hands and his steady, patient expression, and she thought about George Whitfield and about Ohio and about all the conclusions she had drawn from that experience. Then she thought about the creek at dawn and the careful way Raymond had selected yarrow stems. "Friday evening," she said. "Yes." He nodded, something warm moving through his eyes. "I'll come at 6, he said, and put his hat back on and walked out. Hattie Carmichael ran the only proper dining room in Harlan's Crossing alongside her laundry, which said something admirable about her energy. The dining room was attached to the back of her house, 6 tables with white oilcloth covers and decent candles, and it smelled permanently of roasting meat and fresh bread. On Friday evening, when Raymond arrived at Edith's door at exactly 6 o'clock, she was wearing the dark blue wool dress that she privately considered her best, and which she told herself she had chosen for practical reasons of warmth. He had cleaned up from the range fresh-shaved, with a dark coat over his usual clothes, and he held the door open for her and walked beside her to Carmichael's without touching her, which she appreciated for its propriety and was slightly, irrationally disappointed by. They ordered the Friday special, which was roast chicken with root vegetables, and they talked for 2.5 hours. Edith had expected it to be effortful. She was not, by nature, an easy conversationalist in social situations, but it was not effortful at all. Raymond asked about her medical training and listened to the answers with actual interest, not the polite performance of interest that most men managed when a woman began to speak about her professional work. He asked about Dr. Hadley and about the years she had spent in Ohio and about what had made her want to become a healer in the first place. She told him about her mother who had died of a fever when Edith was 9, and about the physician who had come too late and too helplessly, and about the way she had decided at that age that she would learn everything she could about keeping people alive. It was not a story she told often. She told it carefully, watching his face, and he listened to all of it without flinching or offering false comfort. "You've been carrying that a long time," he said. "Most people carry something," she said. "What do you carry?" He was quiet for a moment, and she thought he might deflect it the way men often did. Instead he said, "I had a younger brother, James. Died of a rattlesnake bite in Texas, 1872. I was the one who was supposed to be watching the horses that day, but I'd gone upstream to wash up. He was 17, he paused. I moved around a lot after that, figured if I kept moving I was at least doing something." Edith held his gaze across the oilcloth table. "Did it help?" "No," he said, "but it kept me occupied until I figured out that it wasn't going to help." She thought about George Whitfield and about Ohio, and she decided, for reasons she could not entirely articulate, that Raymond Keene was not going to get that story tonight. He had been honest with her, and she respected that deeply, but she was not ready to be fully honest in return. Not yet. "I think Harlan's Crossing is good for you," she said instead. "Magnus speaks highly of your work. Magnus would tell you I've already reorganized his eastern pasture rotation, and he nearly threw his boot at me for changing things without sufficient consultation," Raymond said, with the first full smile she had seen from him, and it changed his face entirely, opened it up, made the lines at his eyes deepen with warmth. She laughed, genuinely, the sort of laugh she had not expected to produce that evening. They walked back through the warm spring evening and stopped at her door. He touched the brim of his hat and said good night with a simplicity that she found herself thinking about for the next several hours. He left Wildflowers on her doorstep the following morning. This time he had also tucked a small folded piece of paper among the stems. It said, in plain, clean handwriting, "The Yarrow in the south bend of the creek. Thought you should know the location for your records. R.K." She folded the note and put it in her medical record book next to the pressed flowers. Spring deepened into a proper Wyoming spring, which meant that the days went from cold to warm and back again with cheerful unpredictability. And Edith and Raymond found ways to be in each other's company that felt natural without being forced. He began to stop by the clinic in the late afternoons. Not every day, never every day, because he was not the sort of man who made himself either predictable or inconvenient, but often enough that she found herself aware of the clock in the afternoons in a way she had not been before. He told her about the cattle operation on Magnus's ranch, the problems and the practical solutions, and she found herself genuinely interested in the logistics of it, the water access issues, the fence lines, the argument with a neighboring rancher named Clyde Birch about a shared boundary. She told him about her patients, the cases that interested her and the ones that worried her, and he listened with the same full attention he gave to everything else. One afternoon, she rode out to the ranch with him to look at one of Magnus's horses that had developed a swelling in its left foreleg. She was not, strictly speaking, a veterinarian, but she had enough working knowledge of anatomy to be useful, and Raymond knew that. The horse was a gray mare named Clara. "I know," Magnus had said when Edith raised an eyebrow at the name. "I named her before your Mrs. Dean arrived, and I will thank you to drop the subject." And after Edith had examined the leg and determined it was a soft tissue injury rather than anything structural, she showed Raymond how to wrap it properly to support the healing. He was a quick, careful learner. His hands were large and confident with tools and rope, but he applied the same careful precision to the bandaging as she instructed, and when he looked up at her for confirmation that he had done it correctly, they were very close together in the low light of the stable, and she was suddenly, vividly aware of the warmth of him, the smell of leather and clean work, and something that was simply particular to him. She stepped back and told him the wrapping was correct, and she was professional about it, and then she walked outside into the evening air and breathed slowly while Raymond finished settling the mare. He came out a few minutes later and stood beside her looking at the sunset, which was doing something elaborate and golden over the western hills. "You're careful with things," she said, without fully planning to. "What things?" "Most things," she said. "The horse, your work, the way you talk to people." He was quiet for a moment. "My father wasn't," he said, "careful, not with people anyway. I spent a long time figuring out which parts of him I didn't want to be." It was the second honest thing he had told her about himself, and she felt it settle in her chest in a way she was not ready to examine directly. "What was his name?" she asked. "William Keene," Raymond said. "He was a good rancher. Knew cattle like he understood their language, didn't know people at all." He paused. "He and my mother made each other miserable for 20 years, and neither of them ever had the first conversation about it." "My mother and father were happy," Edith said, which surprised her. She had not intended to give him that piece of information. "Very much so. I think that is actually more painful in a way. When the good things end, they take the template with them. You spend a long time looking for the shape of what you've lost." Raymond turned to look at her. The golden evening light was on his face, and the steadiness in his eyes was the same steadiness that had been there at the creek that first morning. "Yes," he said quietly. "That's exactly it." They rode back to town in the soft evening together, not touching but close, the horses walking in easy companionship on the road, and Edith thought with a clarity that was almost frightening that she was in serious danger of letting herself care about this man. She did not know whether to be relieved or terrified by the thought. The trouble, when it arrived, came from a direction she had not anticipated, which was perhaps how trouble usually arrived. Clyde Birch, the neighboring rancher whose boundary dispute with Magnus Pritchett had been simmering since before Raymond's arrival, had apparently decided that Raymond's reorganization of Magnus's eastern pasture rotation had made the boundary question more pressing. He was a heavy, red-faced man of 50, with the disposition of someone who had been in a low-grade fury for so many years it had become his natural state. He arrived at Edith's clinic one Wednesday morning not as a patient, but as a man with a complaint. "You're the one spending time with Keene," he said, standing in her doorway with his hat on, which was in itself a statement of intentional rudeness. Edith looked at him over her patient record book. "I am available for medical matters, Mr. Birch. If this is a social call, I'm afraid I'm occupied." "He's going to push Magnus into pushing that fence line," Birch said. "I know it. Man comes in from nowhere, starts reorganizing, and the next thing you know the line's moved 20 feet into my water access. I want you to tell him to slow down." "Mr. Birch," Edith said, with the particular precision that she used when she wanted to be very clear, "I am a medical professional. I do not convey messages between ranching neighbors, nor would it be remotely appropriate for me to attempt to direct Mr. Keene's professional decisions." If you have a boundary concern, you may speak with Magnus Pritchett, or if the matter is legal, with the county land office in Cheyenne. Birch's face went redder. A woman shouldn't be. I should ask you to remove your hat in my clinic and to leave when you are done, she said, without raising her voice. Good morning. He left. She sat with her hands flat on her record book for a moment and breathed. She told Raymond about it that afternoon. She had not intended to. She was capable of handling her own difficulties. But he came by during the late afternoon, as he sometimes did, and she found that it came out of her naturally, the way information moved towards someone you trusted. Raymond listened to all of it, his jaw set in a way she was coming to recognize, a quiet hardening that was not anger exactly, but something more resolved than that. Birch has been difficult since before I got here, he said. Magnus told me about it. The boundary line is exactly where it was legally established in 1871. I haven't moved anything. But I have put new fence posts on the correct line, which is apparently threatening to him, because the old fence had drifted inward over the years, and he'd been using the extra strip of Magnus's land as his own. So you corrected it. I documented the original survey line and put the fence where it belongs, Raymond said. That's not aggression. It's accuracy. He will not see the distinction, Edith said. No, Raymond agreed. But that's his problem. He paused, looking at her steadily. Did he frighten you? The question was asked without any condescension. It was a genuine inquiry, delivered with the same directness he applied to everything else. No, she said honestly. He annoyed me. There is a difference. I know, he said, and there was something in the acknowledgement, the fact that he understood the difference without her having to explain it, that moved through her in a way that was becoming familiar and alarming in equal measure. She almost told him about George Whitfield that afternoon. Got as far as, there was someone in Ohio, before she stopped herself, and the way he waited without pressing her was patient in a way that made it harder, not easier. Another time, she said. Whenever you want, he said simply, or never if you prefer. He left her with a small bunch of wild columbine that he had apparently picked along the road from the ranch, laid on her windowsill beside his hat while he talked, retrieved when he left. He paused at the door and set them back down deliberately. Those are for you, he said, and walked out before she could determine whether she was moved or frustrated by the gesture, which, she was beginning to understand, was precisely the effect he produced in her on a regular basis. June arrived with its long Wyoming days and warm nights, and the question of what Edith and Raymond were to each other became, gradually, clearer to everyone in Harlan's Crossing, and perhaps slightly less clear to Edith herself, who was engaged in a private argument with her own common sense about the wisdom of what she was feeling. They took a Sunday afternoon walk along the creek, her suggestion, which she noted with private amusement because she was almost certain he would have waited for her to suggest it for another 2 weeks before suggesting it himself. The creek was full with snowmelt, and the banks were impossibly green, wildflowers in such abundance that the land looked almost extravagant with color. He picked flowers as they walked, selecting them with the careful attention he gave to all natural things, and wove a small, rough crown of them that he offered to her without comment, without drama, simply holding it out the way he held out most things as a fact, uncomplicated by performance. She took it and set it on her head and felt absolutely ridiculous and completely free at the same time. Tell me something you have never told anyone in Harlan's Crossing, she said. He walked beside her, looking at the creek. I've been thinking about what I'd do if I wasn't working cattle, he said. I've thought about it more since I came here. What would you do? There's a piece of land 3 miles east of Magnus's property. It borders the creek at a good spot. Deep water year-round, good grass, sheltered from the north wind by a ridge. He paused. I've been thinking about what it would take to buy it, build something on it. He glanced at her. Something that was mine. That didn't move. She understood the weight of what he was saying. He was telling her that he was thinking about stopping, that Harlan's Crossing had given him a reason to think about roots. "It sounds like a good piece of land," she said carefully. "It does to me," he said, "but I'd want to know that something worth staying for would still be here before I started making plans." He looked at her directly. Something other than good grass and creek water. The air between them was very warm and very still. "Raymond," she said, "there is something I need to tell you first." They stopped walking. She turned to face him, holding her ridiculous wildflower crown on with one hand because the slight wind had begun to disturb it, and she told him about George Whitfield. All of it, the 3 years, the engagement, the calm voice he had used when he ended it, the wedding she had learned about from a mutual friend 4 weeks after it happened. She told him about Ohio, and about why she had left, and about the conclusions she had come to about the particular kind of foolishness that came from building your future around another person's intentions. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "He was a coward," Raymond said. It was not said with heat. It was said with the same plain accuracy he applied to fence lines and survey documents. "Yes," she said, "he was." "And you've been waiting," Raymond said, "to see if I was one too." She looked at him steadily. "Wouldn't you?" "Yes," he said, "I would." He reached out and carefully, deliberately, settled her wildflower crown back into position on her head. His fingers brushed her hair, and the touch was so light and so careful that she felt it all the way through her. "I'm not going anywhere, Edith," he said. "I want to be very clear about that. I am not a man who says things he doesn't mean, because I've found there's too much effort involved in keeping track of things you don't actually believe. I mean to stay here. I mean to build on that land if I can. And I mean to—" He stopped, and something in the stopping was more articulate than whatever words had been coming. He simply looked at her, and what was in his eyes was clear and direct and completely serious. She stood in the Wyoming sunshine with her wildflower crown and felt the particular terror of something good beginning to be real. "You should take me to dinner again," she said, because she needed to say something practical and certain, something that had a clear next step. "Friday," he said. "Friday," she said. He smiled at her then, the full warm smile that changed his face, and she allowed herself, with some private ceremony, to stop arguing with herself about what she felt. She was falling in love with Raymond Keene. She was doing it deliberately and with open eyes, which was the only way she knew how to do anything, and it was the most frightening and most alive she had felt in years. The matter of Clyde Birch did not resolve quietly. In early July, Birch brought a formal complaint to the county land office in Cheyenne, claiming Magnus Pritchett had illegally moved the shared boundary fence. This required Raymond to make the 40-mile ride to Cheyenne with the original 1871 survey documents to provide his evidence. He was gone for 5 days, and Edith told herself that the quality of those 5 days, flatter somehow, with a consistent low-grade feeling of something missing, was simply the result of interrupted routine. She missed him. She admitted it to herself on day 3, alone in her clinic in the late afternoon, with the light going gold and no sound of footsteps on her porch. He came back with the surveyor's confirmation that the fence line was correct, and a letter from the county land office formally notifying Birch that his complaint was without merit. He arrived late in the evening, rode dusty and tired, and he knocked on her door because there was a lamp lit in her window and he could see she was still up. She opened the door and he looked at her and she looked at him, and without particular planning she said, "Come inside. I have bread and cold meat and you look like you haven't eaten properly in 5 days." "I haven't," he admitted, and took off his hat and came in. She fed him at the kitchen table, and he told her about Cheyenne and the land office, and she told him about Mrs. Dean's cough, which had finally worsened enough that Edith had convinced her to stay indoors, and about old Abe Kettler's leg, which was healing well, and about Pete Lowry, who had managed to cut his hand on a completely different piece of equipment in what was becoming a concerning pattern. At some point she realized they were talking the way people who lived together talked, easily, informally, without performance. It settled around her like something she had forgotten the feel of. "Edith," he said, when he was done eating and they were sitting across from each other in the lamplight. "Yes," she said. "I'm going to ask Magnus about buying that land next week," he said. Magnus knows the owner, Herd Calloway, old cattle man who moved to Colorado 5 years ago and hasn't done anything with the property since. Magnus thinks Calloway would sell at a fair price. She folded her hands on the table. "And the house you would build," she said. "How many rooms were you thinking?" He looked at her carefully. "How many rooms do you think would be necessary?" It was not, she thought, the most elegant proposal that had ever been made. But it was honest and it was direct and it was Raymond, which meant it was exactly right for her. "At least 3, she said. "A proper kitchen, and a room I could use for patients who needed to be kept nearby." "A clinic room," he said. "A clinic room," she confirmed. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His palm was warm and rough and very certain. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They sat like that for a moment, the lamplight warm between them, and then she turned her hand over under his and held it, and the simplicity of the gesture felt like an enormous and final decision. He kissed her for the first time on the porch of her clinic the following evening, at the end of a Sunday that had included a long walk, a visit to see Magnus's gray mare Clara, whose leg had healed beautifully, and a shared supper at Carmichael's, during which Hattie had looked at both of them with undisguised approval and refilled their coffee twice without being asked. The kiss was careful and unhurried and entirely characteristic of him, and when it ended Edith stood very still for a moment with the warm summer evening all around them. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said. "I had stopped believing in new beginnings," she said. "I want you to know that. Not as a complaint, but because you should understand what those flowers on the doorstep actually meant to me. You left them on the doorstep of a woman who had decided she was done with beginnings, and I can't tell you exactly what shifted, but something did." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I left those flowers because I didn't know how to introduce myself to someone like you without something real in my hands. I didn't know you'd stop believing. I just knew I couldn't walk past your door every morning without doing something about the fact that I couldn't stop thinking about who you were." She looked at him in the summer evening. "Who did you think I was?" "Someone worth slowing down for," he said simply. She took his hand and held it, and this time the gesture was neither careful nor uncertain. It was fully, completely decided. July moved through August, and Harlan's Crossing adjusted to the new arrangement of Edith Reed and Raymond Keene, the way small towns adjusted to everything that was simply true, with considerable observation, some commentary, and eventual acceptance. Hattie Carmichael declared it the most sensible match she had seen in 15 years, which was her highest form of compliment. Magnus Pritchett said nothing at all but began stopping by the clinic slightly more often, and since his shoulder was improving rather than worsening, this told its own story. Clyde Birch, who had lost his boundary dispute entirely and was apparently not the type to absorb a loss quietly, made one final attempt at aggravation by spreading the suggestion around the Harlan's Crossing saloon that a woman practicing medicine unsupervised was liable to do more harm than good, and that it was only a matter of time before someone filed a proper complaint. This reached Edith's ears through Pete Lorre, who reported it with the uncomfortable guilt of someone bringing bad news that he personally found outrageous. Edith was treating his latest injury at the time, a bruised thumb this time, which at least suggested some improvement in the severity of Pete's workplace accidents. "Thank you for telling me, Pete," she said calmly. "He's just mean," Pete said. "Everyone knows it. Most people who damage others are simply in some form of pain that they haven't learned to address," Edith said. "That doesn't excuse it, but it explains it." She handled it the way she handled most things, practically. She wrote a clear, detailed letter to the Wyoming Territorial Board of Medicine reviewing her credentials, her current caseload, and the formal scope of her practice. She sent it with the next week's mail coach. 3 weeks later, she received a confirmation that her appointment was in good standing. She framed the letter and hung it in her clinic, which she felt was both professional and precisely the appropriate statement. When Raymond found out about the letter and what had prompted it, his jaw did that quiet, hardening thing. "I'll speak to Birch," he said. "You absolutely will not," Edith said. "It is handled, Raymond. I handled it. What you can do is confirm, if it comes up, that my medical practice is exactly what my credentials say it is." He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. "All right." And then, after a pause, "You are the most capable person I've ever met." "I know," she said without vanity, because it was simply a fact she had worked hard for, and she was done being modest about hard-won facts. He laughed, a full, warm sound that she had come to love without at that precise moment, having yet said so, and the matter was closed. Magnus agreed to the land sale in August. The owner, old herd Calloway out in Colorado, wrote back with a fair price, and the entire transaction was handled through the county office with remarkable efficiency for the era. The land, 40 acres of good creek-bordering Wyoming ground, became Raymond's in early September, and he stood at its boundary in the golden September afternoon with Edith beside him and was quiet for a long time. "Mine," he said finally. Just the one word. She stood beside him and understood the weight of it for a man who had been moving for 5 years. "Yours," she agreed. He turned to look at her. The September wind was moving through the long grass and the creek was bright in the afternoon light and the ridge behind the property was throwing a long, sheltering shadow. "I want to build it right," he said. "The house, I don't want to rush it." "I wouldn't expect you to," she said. "It'll take the winter to source materials properly. I want sound timber, not whatever's fastest. And I want the foundation to be stone, not just sod." He looked at the land with a sort of quiet reverence that she found entirely moving. "Come spring, I'll start building." "Come spring," she said. He looked at her and she looked at him, and the warm, certain thing between them was fully present in the September afternoon. "I love you," he said. It was the first time either of them had said it. He said it with the same directness he brought to all true things, simply, without decoration, as a statement of plain fact. "I want you to know that before I start making plans that include both of us, because they do, if you'll have it that way." Edith stood in the Wyoming September with the wind in the grass and the creek running behind them, and the man she had not expected to exist standing beside her, and she felt the tectonic shift of something enormous coming to rest. "I love you," she said. "I've been trying not to say it too soon, but I think September is not too soon." He smiled at her, the full warm smile, and reached for her hand. "September is exactly right," he said. He kissed her there on his 40 acres of Wyoming land with the afternoon going gold around them, and it was a proper kiss, thorough and unhurried in the way he was thorough and unhurried about everything that mattered. She thought about the doorstep. The first morning, the wildflowers damp with dew, left by a man she had not yet met who had apparently decided, after asking Magnus one question about her, that she was worth approaching with something real in his hands. She thought about the woman who had stood holding those flowers and felt something stir and quickly smothered it, the woman who had decided hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. She thought about how wrong she had been. Not foolishly wrong, she had been protecting herself from real damage, and she did not regret the caution. But wrong, finally and completely, about whether new beginnings were real. They were real. They were standing in a Wyoming field with their hands joined and 40 acres of good land all around them, and they were entirely real. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was a hard one, which Wyoming winters reliably were. The snow came early in November and settled with serious intent, and Harlan's Crossing pulled in on itself the way small frontier towns did in bad weather, closer together, more dependent on each other, the distances between people and places that felt navigable in summer turning significant and cold. Raymond continued his work for Magnus, which winter adjusted rather than stopped cattle in hard weather required more attention and more care, not less. He rode out in conditions that made Edith's chest tight with a worry she managed by keeping busy, and he always came back, which she knew was not a guarantee, and chose not to dwell on except in the quiet hours. He came to her clinic every evening he was in town, and on the evenings he came in from the ranch late and cold. She had learned to have something hot ready, not because she felt it was her obligation, but because she wanted to, because feeding someone you loved through a hard winter was one of the most straightforward expressions of care available to a person. They talked about the house. He had bought his materials, a load of pine timber from a mill outside of Cheyenne that had arrived on a wagon in October, stacked now under a tarp on the land, with the serious intention of becoming walls and a roof. He had drawn plans on paper, careful and precise, and he showed them to her by her fire one winter evening, spread across her kitchen table. She looked at the plan for the clinic room at the end of the house with its own entrance from the outside, its own small stove, space enough for 2 beds and a proper supply cabinet. "You made it larger than I suggested," she said. "I did," he said. "A 1-bed clinic room is for when things go routinely. You told me the worst nights are when you have more than one person to watch." He pointed to the 2nd bed space. "Room for 2, and I've built in a shelf system here for supplies." She looked at the careful pencil lines of his planning and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "You listened," she said. "I always listen," he said, and it was said without any self-congratulation, simply as true. She reached across the plans and put her hand over his. "Raymond," she said. "Yes," he said. "Ask me properly," she said. He looked at her across the kitchen table with the plans between them and the fire going and the winter wind outside, and he was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was organizing his thoughts into their right order. "Edith Reed," he said, "I would like very much for you to marry me. Not because of the house or the land, though those are part of it, because building something means building it with someone, and the someone I want is you. You are the most honest and capable and infuriating person I have ever spent time with, and I cannot imagine wanting to spend time with anyone else. Will you marry me?" She had thought, when this moment came, that she might have to navigate some complex internal geography, that there might be remnants of George Whitfield and Ohio that needed to be settled before she could arrive at yes. But she discovered, sitting across from Raymond Keene in the firelight with his careful house plans between them, that there was no navigating to do. The question was only whether she was brave enough to say clearly what she already knew. "Yes," she said, "completely and without reservation, yes." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring plain gold, set with a small turquoise stone that was deeply blue in the firelight. He had, she would later learn, ordered it from a jeweler in Cheyenne 2 months ago and had been carrying it since October, waiting for the right moment. He slid it onto her finger and it fit exactly. "How did you know the size?" she asked. "I asked Mrs. Dean," he said. "Told her it was for a patient reference. She didn't believe me for a second." Edith laughed the full, real laugh, and he caught it and held it like a gift, which it was. They were married in March of 1879, in the small church at the center of Harlan's Crossing, on a day that couldn't decide between winter and spring, and ultimately provided both in alternating installments. The snow had mostly retreated, but there were patches of it still in the shadows of buildings, and the early crocuses had pushed through the ground with the stubborn optimism of early crocuses everywhere. Reverend Ellis, who was a practical man who had married and buried a great many people in his time, and had a realistic view of both activities, performed the ceremony with warmth and economy. Magnus Pritchett sat in the front pew looking deeply satisfied in the manner of a man whose good idea had confirmed itself. Hattie Carmichael cried, which surprised no one. Pete Laurie attended with both arms injury-free, which Edith considered a wedding gift. She wore her dark blue dress, her best one, and she had plaited her dark hair up with a few small wildflowers, dried ones. From the flowers Raymond had left on her doorstep the first and second mornings, which she had pressed in her record book and kept woven through the arrangement, which only she and Raymond understood the meaning of. He saw them when she walked toward him, and something moved across his face that was more eloquent than anything he could have said. She took her place beside him and looked up at him in the cold spring light coming through the church windows, and she thought, with a clarity she trusted entirely, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not where she had planned to be, not where she had expected to be, but something more important than either of those things, where she was truly meant to be. The vows were traditional, because the year was 1879, and this was Wyoming, and neither Edith nor Raymond had any inclination toward eccentricity in their wedding ceremony. But when the Reverend came to the part about love and commitment, Raymond held her gaze with the same steady directness that had characterized everything he had ever given her, and she held his with the same clear, decided steadiness she was bringing to the life they were starting. It was enough. It was more than enough. They spent the first months of their marriage in Edith's rented rooms from Magnus while the house was built, which was an arrangement full of a compact, cheerful domesticity that suited them both better than expected. Raymond built the house himself primarily, with help from Magnus's ranch hand Thomas Birch on the weekends and Pete Lowry on days when Pete was not actively injuring himself at the smithy. The house went up through April and May with the sound of hammers and the smell of pine timber in the clear Wyoming air. Edith visited the site most evenings. She watched the stone foundation rise first, exactly as Raymond had planned it, solid, deliberate, built to last rather than built to be quick. Then the frame, the walls, the roof. She watched the clinic room take shape at the end of the building, with its outside entrance and its two-bed space and its carefully constructed shelving, and she felt a particular kind of love for the man who had designed it that was deeper and quieter and more complete than the dazzle of the earlier months. She was not, she understood now, in love with Raymond Keene in the way that stories described falling in love, not with the sweep and the drama and the loss of reason. She was in love with him in the way that solid things were built layer by layer, deliberately, with attention to the foundation. It was more durable than the stories. It was warmer than the stories, and it was hers. They moved into the house in June of 1879. It was a warm morning, the kind of Wyoming June morning that justified every hard winter that preceded it, with the creek running full and bright behind the property and the wildflowers on the south bank so abundant they seemed impossible. Raymond carried her across the threshold, which was traditional, and she laughed at him for it while cooperating entirely with the gesture. He had made the kitchen exactly as she had specified: plenty of shelving, a large work surface, windows that looked out over the creek bank. He had built the furniture himself, the table and chairs from the pine timber, solid and plain and beautifully finished. On the kitchen windowsill, in a new tin cup, he had placed a small bundle of fresh wildflowers. Bluebell and yarrow and Indian paintbrush and columbine, every variety he had ever left on her doorstep, assembled together as if in summary. She stood looking at them for a long moment. "First morning," he said from behind her. She turned and looked at him standing in their kitchen in the June sunshine, her husband of 3 months, the man who had crouched at the creek at dawn selecting stems with careful attention and left them on the doorstep of a woman who had decided she was done with beginnings. "First morning," she agreed. She went to him and kissed him in the sunlit kitchen, and the wildflowers stood in their cup on the windowsill, and the creek ran behind the house, and the long Wyoming summer opened up in front of them like something that had been waiting all along to be reached. The clinic room filled Edith with a specific professional joy that she allowed herself to feel without guilt. She set up her supply cabinet exactly as she had planned, organized her instruments with the precision that Dr. Hadley had instilled in her, and within the first week of being open, had 2 patients: old Mr. Kettler's son, young Aaron, who had managed to get a fishhook embedded in his palm at the creek, and a woman named Mary Beaumont who had ridden in from a homestead 15 miles away and who had a respiratory infection that needed careful management. Mary Beaumont was 23, recently arrived in Wyoming Territory with her husband Frank, and she was homesick and frightened and sick enough to need watching for 2 days. Edith kept her in the clinic room, which was exactly what it had been built for, and sat with her in the evenings when the coughing was bad. And by the end of 2 days, Mary Beaumont was well enough to go home, but had decided that Edith Reed Keene was the finest person she had met since leaving Missouri. "How do you stand it out here?" Mary asked on the second day, sitting up in the clinic bed with better color in her cheeks. "So far from everything. Don't you get lonely?" Edith considered the question. From the clinic room, she could hear the faint sound of Raymond working on the fence line outside, the periodic rhythm of a hammer. Through the window, she could see the creek and the wildflower bank and the ridge that sheltered the property from the north wind. "No," she said honestly, "not anymore." Raymond came into the clinic to bring Edith her supper that evening. He had taken to doing this on the evenings she was with a patient, bringing food to both Edith and whoever needed watching, which patients tended to appreciate enormously, and he greeted Mary Beaumont with the same quiet, unhurried courtesy he brought to all human interactions. Mary watched him go back through the connecting door to the kitchen, and then looked at Edith with an expression of undisguised admiration. "Oh," Mary said simply. "Yes," Edith agreed, and did not bother to suppress her smile. The summer and fall of 1879 settled into a rhythm that was full and purposeful and deeply satisfying, in a way Edith had not had the imagination to specifically want, but recognized immediately as what she had been in one of all along. The clinic was busy. The news of a capable medical practitioner at the Keene property spread through the surrounding homestead and ranch community, and Edith found herself treating not just the residents of Harlan's Crossing, but families from miles around who were not willing to make the 40-mile trip to Cheyenne for a physician's attention. She was careful about the limits of her formal credentials, always clear with patients about what she could and could not do, and when cases exceeded her expertise, she arranged the Cheyenne trip with efficient determination. But her expertise was broader than most people credited, and she saved lives that year by being present and competent and willing. Raymond managed Magnus's ranch through the summer and began the slow process of building his own small cattle operation on their 40 acres. A starting herd of 12 head purchased at the autumn market in Laramie, good stock that would winter well with proper care. He worked with a methodical patience that suited him, never trying to do more than the land and the season could support. In the evenings they sat on the porch of their house and watched the Wyoming sky do its considerable best with color, and they talked about everything about medicine and cattle, and the people they'd treated and managed, about the town and the land, about the large and small questions of their life. Sometimes they were quiet together, which was its own language. He left wildflowers on the kitchen windowsill every morning that they grew, through the summer, through fall. When the snow finally came and the flowers were done for the season, he left her a small sprig of dried lavender that he had traded for at the general store, which was so characteristically Raymond, not defeated by the season's limitations but finding the available equivalent, that she kept it, and added it to the tin cup with the dried specimens from earlier months. In November, Edith sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded and looked at Raymond over her medical record book, which she had closed with a certain deliberateness. "I believe I am expecting," she said. He was by the fire, mending a piece of tack, and he went very still. He looked up at her slowly. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Not with the certainty I would have in a modern hospital," she said, "but with the certainty available to a woman who has been a medical practitioner for 7 years and knows her own body. Yes, I believe so." He set the tack down carefully on the floor and came to the table. He sat down across from her. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, something beneath the steadiness, something moved and open and overwhelmed in the best possible way. "Edith," he said. "I know," she said. He reached for both her hands across the table and held them in his. He was quiet for a long moment, and she let him be, because some things needed their right amount of silence. "Are you well?" he asked, "How are you feeling?" "I'm tired in the mornings," she said, "and I am monitoring everything with professional attention, which is the advantage of the situation." "Are you frightened?" She considered this honestly. "A little, and very much not, both things at once." "Same," he said. She looked at him across the table, this man who did not rush things, who had left wildflowers on her doorstep before he had a single word to say to her, who had built her a clinic room into their house without being asked, who loved her with such complete and uncomplicated certainty. "We're going to be very good at this," she said. "Yes," he said. "We are." The winter pregnancy was managed, as Edith managed all things, with practical intelligence and without unnecessary drama. She continued her work in the clinic through the colder months, modifying her hours as needed, and wrote to Dr. Hadley in Ohio for additional reference materials on obstetrics, which arrived in March and which she read with the combined perspective of a practitioner and a patient, which she found clarifying in both capacities. She was careful. She rested when rest was indicated. She ate well. She was exactly the kind of patient she would have instructed someone else to be, and the fact that following her own advice was significantly easier than she had expected amused her. Raymond was quietly magnificent through the winter. He took on the heavier work without commentary or martyrdom. He came home every evening. He asked her how she was feeling with genuine interest and without hovering, which was the exact right balance. On the mornings when the fatigue was heaviest, he brought her tea and bread before she had to ask for it. And on the mornings when she was fine and wanted to get up and see patients, he moved out of her way and got on with his own work without a word, because he understood her and knew the difference between the mornings she needed help and the mornings she simply needed to be let alone to be capable. This, she thought, on a February morning watching the snow come down outside the kitchen window, was what love actually looked like when it was real. Not the first kiss or the wildflowers on the doorstep, though those had been real and meaningful in their own right. But this, the daily, specific knowledge of another person, the practical fluency in each other's needs, the ordinary faithfulness of a Tuesday in February. She was so grateful it almost hurt. The baby was born in June of 1880, on a warm morning that made the year of his making seem providential. He was a boy, healthy, loud, with Raymond's dark eyes and Edith's stubborn expression from the very first day. They named him James, after Raymond's brother, and Raymond held him in the hour after his birth with a gentleness so complete that Edith, who had not cried once in the 2 years since Ohio, cried a little into her pillow while pretending to rest. Magnus Pritchett came to visit 2 days after James was born, limped in on his bad hip, and held the baby with the careful attention of a man who had been around cattle long enough to understand the handling of fragile and valuable things. "Boy looks like you," he told Raymond. "He looks like his mother," Raymond said. "Both," Magnus said firmly, and handed James back to Edith with a dignity that said he was done being sentimental and would thank them not to notice he had been. Hattie Carmichael brought food for a week. Pete Lowry, who had graduated from apprentice to full blacksmith in the spring and managed to arrive without any new injuries, brought a small carved wooden horse that he had made himself, which was rough but clearly made with real care. Edith lay in their bed with James in the crook of her arm and Raymond in the chair beside her, and outside the window the Wyoming June was doing its impossible beautiful best, and the creek was running, and the wildflowers were in full abundance on the south bank. "Are you happy?" Raymond asked. She looked at him. The question was earnest, entirely without irony, the way he asked all things that mattered. "More than I knew was possible," she said. "More than I thought I was allowed to be." He reached over and took her free hand, gently so as not to disturb the baby. "You're allowed," he said. She believed him. She had been learning to believe him for 2 years, and by now the lesson was fully absorbed, not as an act of faith which required uncertainty, but as a known thing, as settled as the stone foundation of their house. She believed him. Clyde Birch, for the record, ultimately lost a separate water rights dispute with another neighbor the following year and sold his ranch. He moved to Nebraska. Harlan's Crossing adjusted to his absence with the same equanimity it brought to most changes, which was to say it was noted, absorbed, and not much mourned. The town itself grew through 1880 and 1881, as towns in the Wyoming Territory did in those years, a new general store, an expansion of Carmichael's dining room, a proper schoolhouse built in the fall of 1881. Edith was instrumental in the planning of the schoolhouse, not because she was on the town council. Women in 1880, Wyoming, were not on town councils, but because she knew more about children's health and the conditions necessary for their well-being than anyone else in Harlan's Crossing, and the men on the town council had enough collective intelligence to ask her. She told them what the schoolhouse needed in terms of light and ventilation and clean water access, and most of it was implemented, which she considered a modest but real victory. Raymond's cattle operation expanded carefully through 1880 and 1881. He was not a man who expanded for the sake of it. He added stock when the land could support it, improved his water access when he had the materials to do it correctly, and built a proper barn in the fall of 1880 that he spent 4 months on because he wanted it to stand for 50 years. It would, Edith thought when she saw the finished structure solid and square, and built with the same unhurried deliberateness as everything Raymond made. Magnus Pritchett's health declined slowly through 1881, as the health of 73-year-old men in hard country sometimes did. His hip grew worse despite Edith's careful management of it, and he moved more slowly through the summer and fall. He came to dinner at the Keene house every Sunday, which had become a standing arrangement that all three of them maintained without discussion, because it had simply become true. He sat in the chair by the kitchen fire and held baby James when the boy would permit it, and told stories about the Wyoming Territory in the early years, the 1860s, before the railroad, when the land had been an altogether wilder proposition, with the authority and occasional embellishment of a man who had been there, and earned the right to tell it any way he liked. On a Sunday in October of 1881, he told Raymond, over the dinner table, that he wanted to discuss the ranch. "I have no children," Magnus said in his barrel-chested, blunt way. "My wife's been gone 14 years. The land and stock are worth something, and I want them to go somewhere they'll be properly run." Raymond looked at him across the table. "Magnus," he said. "Don't get sentimental," Magnus said. "I'm telling you because it's practical. I want to draw up the proper papers with the county office this winter. You'll keep running the operation, and in due course it becomes yours." He looked at Edith. "And you'll keep running that clinic room whether I'm here or not, because this territory needs it." Edith looked at Magnus Pritchett, who had rented her a house when she arrived and been honest with her about Raymond when she asked, and who came to dinner every Sunday and held her son with careful old hands. "Thank you," she said quietly. "It's business," he said gruffly. But he was looking at the baby, who was asleep in the carry basket by the fire, with an expression that was not entirely business. He was gone in the spring of 1882, in his sleep, on a mild March night, which was, Edith thought, a merciful way for a hard-living man to end things. She sat with Raymond on the porch the evening after the burial, the March air cold and clean, and they were quiet together for a long time. "He was a good man," Raymond said. "He was," Edith said. "He gave me a reason to stop moving," Raymond said. "Before you did." She leaned against him in the cold evening. He put his arm around her and they sat looking at the dark Wyoming sky, which was extravagantly full of stars in the way that only the sky far from city lights could manage, and she thought about how long a road had led to this porch, to this man, to this life. She thought about Ohio, and about the clinic doorstep, and about wildflowers in dew. She thought about what it meant to stop believing in beginnings, and then, without particularly intending to begin. Spring came to Harlan's Crossing with the reliable optimism of seasons that have survived a hard winter. The wildflowers came back along the creek as they always did. The Indian paintbrush first, then the yarrow, then the bluebell and columbine in their abundance, as if the land was performing a particular annual generosity that had nothing to do with human difficulty and everything to do with simply being alive. Edith stood at the kitchen window one April morning, 14 months after James was born, watching the sun come up over the eastern ridge. Raymond was already outside, moving through the early light toward the barn, his figure familiar and certain in a way that still had the capacity to fill her with a quiet, enormous warmth. James was asleep in the next room. The clinic room was set up for a morning patient, Mrs. Clara Dean, whose cough was once again requiring attention and who had at least finally agreed to limit her time in cold night air. She looked at the windowsill, the tin cup, the small bunch of wildflowers Raymond had left there before he went out, the first of the season, just 3 stems of early clover and 1 brave columbine, still damp from the morning ground. First morning, every spring, every year. She picked up the columbine and turned it between her fingers, and she thought about beginnings, not with grief or wariness or the careful management of hope that had characterized her first year in Harlan's Crossing, simply with the clarity of a woman who had been wrong about something and was glad to have been corrected. New beginnings were real. They arrived without announcement, sometimes in the form of wildflowers left by a man you hadn't yet met, a man who moved through the world with such quiet deliberateness that the world responded to him by organizing itself around his steady presence. They arrived on doorsteps and at creek banks and across kitchen tables. They arrived in the form of a house built stone by stone with a clinic room designed to the specifications of the person you loved. They arrived the way Raymond had arrived in Harlan's Crossing, without fanfare, with his hat touched at the brim, with a patient attention to what was actually real and what was actually worth staying for. She put the columbine back in the cup and went to start the morning properly. Later that morning, after Mrs. Dean's visit and a quick check on a young farmer named Isaac Birch, Thomas's brother, newly arrived in the area, who had strained his back unloading a wagon and needed guidance on rest and simple stretching, Edith walked out to the fence line where Raymond was working on a section of post replacement. He looked up when he heard her, and he straightened and waited, as he always waited, without hurrying her toward whatever she had come to say. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said, taking off his gloves. "We are going to need the clinic room again," she said, "for the period between approximately October and November, I would expect." He looked at her for a moment. Then he understood. "Edith," he said, the way he said her name when things moved him simply, as if her name itself contained the rest of what he needed to say. "I know," she said. He crossed the space between them in a few strides and cupped her face in both his warm, work-rough hands and kissed her with the complete attentiveness he had always brought to everything he gave her. "How are you feeling?" he asked when he pulled back. "Entirely well," she said, "and monitoring everything professionally as before." "Good," he said. He kept his hands on her face, thumbs moving gently. "Boy or girl, what do you think?" "I think it is too early to speculate," she said with professional rigor. "I think it'll be a girl," he said. "James needs someone to argue with," she laughed. "He's 14 months old. He can barely argue with his own porridge." "He argues with it every morning," Raymond pointed out. "He has the instinct. He just needs a worthy opponent." She looked up at him in the April sunshine. This man who thought about his son's future arguments and built things to last 50 years and left wildflowers every morning that they grew. And the love she felt was so complete and so present and so entirely without the old shadows that it was almost like a physical thing she could hold. "Come home for supper at a reasonable hour," she said. "I will," he said, and kissed her once more lightly and let her go. She walked back to the house through the April morning, the creek bright behind it, the wildflowers starting to take hold on the south bank, the house square and solid and built with stone and pine, and the particular love of a man who understood that the best things were made to endure. She stepped through the front door of the home they had built together. There were wildflowers on the windowsill, just as there always were. She breathed in the particular smell of the house wood and morning coffee, and the clean air coming through the window, and she felt, completely and without any reservation whatsoever, the full weight of a life she had chosen and that had chosen her back. In October of 1882, their daughter was born. She was loud and certain from the first moment, and regarded the world with an expression of clear-eyed assessment that Raymond, looking at her in his arms the night of her birth, said was entirely her mother's. "She has your eyes," Edith said. "She has your way of looking at things," he said, "like she's already decided what's real and what isn't." They named her Clara, not for Mrs. Dean exactly, though when Mrs. Dean heard, she was moved to tears that she dignified with some effort. For the gray mare whose leg had healed in Magnus's stable, on the afternoon Edith and Raymond had stood too close together in the low stable light, and something had shifted between them without words. For the small, certain things that led toward large ones. James, who was 2.5 and possessed of the suspicious proprietary instincts of a firstborn, examined his sister for approximately 4 minutes, and then attempted to share his wooden horse with her, which Edith and Raymond both agreed was a promising sign. The house held all of them: the clinic room, the kitchen with its wildflower windowsill, the bedroom where 2 children slept in the particular abandon of very small people who have never had a reason to be guarded in their sleep. Raymond and Edith sat on the porch in the October evening, the children down, the ranch settled, the stars beginning their reliable appearance in the enormous Wyoming sky. "We should write to Dr. Hadley," Raymond said. "Tell him how the clinic room has done this year." "I've been meaning to," Edith said. 43 patients since June, 11 cases that would otherwise have required Cheyenne, 2 that I did refer to Cheyenne and both recovered well." "You should be proud," he said. "I am," she said. "I'm not modest about things I've worked for." He turned to look at her in the October dark, and in the lamplight from the window she could see his face, the familiar weathered lines, the steadiness in his eyes, the scar along his jaw that she had long since stopped noticing except in the moments when she was particularly aware of how much she loved him. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "About the first morning," he said. "At the creek. You came walking up and you already knew my name and you told me I should have introduced myself properly." He paused. "I've been thinking about whether you were right." "Of course I was right," she said. "The flowers worked, though," he said, with the almost smile she had first seen at the creek 2.5 years ago. "The flowers worked," she conceded. "Then I'll keep leaving them," he said. "I would be disappointed if you stopped," she said. He reached over and took her hand in the October darkness. The creek was running behind the house. The ridge was a dark line against the sky. The land that was theirs fully now, Magnus's ranch and their own 40 acres, spread away in all directions in the quiet. "Raymond," she said. "Yes," he said. "Thank you," she said. "For stopping, for Harlan's crossing, for the flowers." She paused. "For knowing that a woman who has decided she's done with beginnings might be persuaded otherwise if someone bothered to try." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know any of that," he said honestly. "I just knew I wanted to give you something real before I had anything to say, and the flowers were real." He squeezed her hand. "You did the rest." She looked at the Wyoming sky and felt the October air and heard the creek and thought about beginnings. How they arrived without ceremony, how they required courage rather than certainty, how the best ones came in quiet forms and grew into vast, solid, enduring things. She had stopped believing in them once. She would not make that mistake again. She leaned against her husband's shoulder on the porch of their house, and the stars came out in their full Wyoming extravagance, and the world was quiet and complete and entirely theirs, and it would remain so for a very long time.